Hey, welcome back. Alrighty, time for another lecture, lecture 5 of chapter 1. So this one, let's throw it on there. We're going to talk about this nature-nurture thing. Actually, I'm going to weave together a few things that you've been reading about, some of them in sort of different sections so far, but I'm going to try to connect some of them up so that you see how they all relate to each other. Along the way, we're going to tell a story of a particular time in history when some really scary things happened related to this nature versus nurture distinction. Things I honestly didn't know about when I went to university. I was surprised when I first learned about something I will be telling you about shortly. I'm teasing you now. So I feel as a professor, it's really important that everybody knows that this happened and understands the danger that still lurks. Alrighty, how is that for a teaser? Let's jump in. I'm going to start here because the textbook, there's some confusion over this tabula rasa comment. Aristotle definitely mentioned it. So tabula rasa translates to blank slate. And Aristotle kind of believed it, as you'll see. But when I show you what you're looking at right now in a second, for some reason, John Locke, the philosopher John Locke, is often associated with the tabula rasa term. But again, if we start here, Plato's student Aristotle believed that the mind and soul results from our anatomical and physiological experiences. So he was sort of a monoist. He didn't really believe in this dualist sort of notion of a spiritual soul separate from whatever. He kind of thought the mind and soul were kind of one, and that they did result from the interactions we had with the world. So it says in the second one, in other words, we are who we are, and what we know are as a result of our experiences along life. Okay, so I think really Aristotle maybe mentioned the tabula rasa term and held these ideas, but then perhaps it was John Locke that really forwarded and pushed this concept, and maybe that's why I sometimes associate this more with John Locke. But he certainly also believed in this monoist notion. So John Locke, not a dualist, not believing more like a materialist kind of perspective, but he also theorized that we all start with a blank slate and that it becomes written on as we go. Experience writes on our slate, and that becomes our story. That becomes who we are. Okay, those ideas, that we can trace back to Aristotle for sure, they relate to this nature versus nurture distinction. And really, the core question that the nature-nurture controversy surrounds is, what made you the person you are today? So, if we think about you have opinions, you have things you like and things you don't like, you have social groups that you interact with and others that you don't. We could go through the whole list. You have possessions of certain sorts that you value, and other sorts of things you don't value. So you have a set of values associated with it. Where did all of that come from? Everything that makes you who you are, where did that come from? And the distinction of the nature-nurture issue is that what we've been talking about with the blank slate is actually on the nurture side. So that's actually over here. So if we start there, nurture, the idea is as we live, as we go through life, we have experiences. Stuff happens to us. So things from our environment, specific childhood experiences we had. Maybe we almost drowned in a pool and therefore we're afraid of water now, and then that might be a part of who we are. How we were raised. Maybe our parents treated us in certain ways, and we think that has shaped who we are. The social relationships we've had along the way. We've been interacting with various people. Sometimes these social relationships go fantastic. Sometimes they don't. Do they change us as a function of what we experience? And of course, the culture that we're born into and the values and such that culture has and that our parents have. We can think of culture right down to our family, and then we can kind of go out bigger and imagine it as our cultural group, our nation, etc. And those things are going to have an influence. How much are they shaping who you've become? Okay, these are the things that Aristotle and Locke are highlighting. right? They're saying when you have these experiences, they change you. They write on that tabula rasa. They make you who you are. Okay. Now, the counter view is the nature side. And it's really tricky to call it counter because, as you'll see, we often like to say is something because of nature or nurture. But as you'll see, the answer is almost always both. So both of these things may be at play, and it's really about emphasis. But if we go to the nature side first, just to get a sense of what that's about, the nature side says, well, you are who you are because of the genes that you have inherited. You have a DNA structure. We know that DNA structure sort of informs the building of our body. So things like physical appearance, we know is a function of the genes that we inherited, right? If both of your parents are tall, you're more likely to be tall. If both of your parents are short, you're not very likely to be tall, etc. So a lot of our physical appearance is certainly related to our genetics, which come from our parents, which is why we call them heredity factors, right? We've inherited certain characteristics. There's also a good reason to believe our personalities are somehow related to these genetics that we carry. I always say this, if you think of your, we certainly know, let's talk about intelligence. Let's go there. That if your parents are relatively intelligent, you're more likely to be intelligent. We certainly know that there's a genetic connection to intelligence. And so this is the real distinction. How much of us is because of the sort of things we were born with, the things we inherited, our biology. How much of a role does our biology play in making us who we are? And how much of a role does our environment play, the interactions we have in terms of making us who we are? So there's the nature and the nurture. And so now let's tell a story, because throughout history, there's been kind of, and especially in the psychology world, there's been sort of waxes and wanes in terms of whether people were excited about nature influences or whether they were excited about nurture influences. And that sort of excitement and change in it certainly informs the way that psychology developed. And so let's tell that story a little bit, and we'll get to that scary point along the way. Okay, so imagine you're a biologist, first of all. What biologists spent a lot of time doing, pre-Darwin, we're going to highlight Darwin in just a moment here. So pre-Darwin, biologists would spend a lot of time categorizing members of some animal group. So we have dogs here, for example, and they would try to figure out, how dogs, what dogs were subgroups. So, might call them species or breeds or whatnot, etc. And they would categorize animals. So they would reptiles versus mammals. We know all these categorizations. And that's often what biologists did. They would look at the features of an animal and they would say, oh, what category? Is this a snake? Is this a frog? Is this amphibian? Is it a reptile? Is it an amphibian? Is it a mammal, etc.? And they would come up for rules that would put some animal within a certain class. And they spent a lot of time classifying the features of animals. What Darwin did, let's do Darwin over here. What Darwin did is say, hey, there's a reason animals look the way they do. Okay, one of the things that really influenced Darwin, and really what I'm depicting in the center screen here, is something called artificial selection. For years, for centuries, humans have been engaged in what we called selective breeding of animals. And the classic cases of this are the dog, but also the horse, right? A lot of people from way back, horse racing was a sport of kings. It's called the sport of kings. Kings would try to create really, really fast horses, and they would race against other countries and other kingdoms, and the horse was a great thing of pride. And so they were trying to make, that's the right way to say it, the fastest horses they could. And they learned early on a basic rule that if you artificially force two animals to breed, The offspring tends to have the characteristics of the animals that bred. So if you're looking, for example, a fast horse, what you want to do is find a really fast male horse and a really fast female horse and have them breed, because their offspring are more likely to be fast compared to if you just taken a random male and female. So by intentionally deciding who breeds, you can choose the fastest and end up with faster offspring. Now you can do that as well for just physical features other than, that's speed that the horse racing is all about. But what if you wanted a horse that looked a certain way, or a dog that looked a certain way? Let's say you want a dog that's really black. Well, what do? Well, over generations, a number of breeding cycles, you find the blackest dog, the blackest male dog you can find, and the blackest female dog you can find. And if they breed together, they're likely to produce pup litters that have a lot of black pups in them. And in fact, possibly some black pups that are even blacker than their parents were. And so you can now take those ones, and preferably you're breeding with a whole different set of genetics somewhere else, and find a really black female. And through successive generations, by having the blackest of the pups mate, you will end up producing a breed of dogs that have certain physical characteristics. And you can kind of decide what physical characteristics you want. How tall, how big do you want the dog? How small do you want it? What about its head? How long is its nose? What kind of ears do you want on the dog? And by, it's just selectively breeding, you can produce all of these different, what we now call breeds. So we think of a Labrador as different from a German Shepherd, right? They're very different kinds of dogs. They look very different. All German Shepherds have a look, Labs have a look. So within the class, they look similar, but between, they look very different. Now, if any of you know dogs, they don't just breed dogs for the looks. They also breed dogs for temperament. And the example here would be a lab. Labs were usually used as duck hunting companions back in the day. That's why they're called retrievers, because typically the hunter would shoot the duck would fall into the water, and the labs love to swim. We bred them that way. Okay, we found dogs that like to swim and bred them together, and we end up with pups that like to swim. So labs have been bred to be, there's a black lab and there's a chocolate lab, but they've been bred to have the look they have, but they've also been bred to like water, and they've been bred to have what we call a gentle mouth. If you're going to eat that duck, you don't want, like if you send a German Shepherd after it, the German Shepherd would probably, its inclination might be, I'm just going to eat this duck myself. But labs have been bred from dogs that don't do that instead pick up that thing very gently. And that's what you want. You want it to go fetch that, to go retrieve that duck, and to bring it and to give it to you without damaging it. You don't want a bunch of teeth marks all through the duck. So, etc. So, those labs have been bred to have certain physical features, yes, but almost more important, certain personality characteristics. Is that what we want to call it? Likes to swim, has a gentle, carries things in a gentle way. That kind of sounds like personality characteristics. Okay. All this to say, Darwin knew all about artificial selection, and he knew that somehow the characteristics of a set of parents were passed down to their offspring. He didn't know how. In fact, let's just throw this dude in here. Mendel figured out how. Okay, so Mendel was the one that really understood the process by which these genes are inherited. Darwin didn't know that at the time. You see the slight difference in the times of when they were doing their thing. But all Darwin really did is say, instead of having a human choose which two animals are breeding, we call that artificial selection, maybe there's something that happens that's like that, but something that happens in nature without humans doing stuff. Maybe there is what he called natural selection, not artificial selection, but natural selection. And so the idea of natural selection is maybe the animals themselves seek out certain characteristics in their breeding partners. And those characteristics, of course, will be more likely to be passed down to generations. Not going to go into a bunch of detail with Darwin. He'll pop up through the course, and we'll talk about evolution theory a little bit more off and on as we go through. The point I really want to make here is at this point in time, and we're talking late 1800s here, suddenly the world became really interested in these nature kinds of things, in inheritance, in evolution, in genetics. So as we learned that process by which traits are inherited, we started to learn about genetics and how they work thanks to the work of Mendel. Suddenly everyone was like fascinated by this. And there became a real focus on the impact of nature over nurture. So people stopped, they weren't all that excited about the effective experience anymore. They were excited about this, genetics, and how things get inherited from one species to the next. And the scientific community really became fascinated with this. So here's one example, Sir Francis Galton. And again, I want you to kind of keep an eye on the dates here because they're going to be kind of important. Darwin was sort of 1860-ish, so you'd see Galton would be maybe about 40 at that point in time. So that's when he started learning about Darwin, and he did this kind of funny thing. So it turns out, by the way, as you'll see here, Galton was a cousin of Darwin. And that's in part what kind of led him to start thinking this way, I think. I think he thought, wow, Darwin's a really smart guy. Maybe he thought, I'm a really smart guy. And by the way, we got this other cousin over there named Wedgwood. He's a pretty smart guy too. So if you look at the code here, if you see these boxes with the box within it and it's marked brilliant, Galton just gave himself scientific ability. So that's not quite brilliant. But he still said, I'm a man of scientific ability. So that's an intellectual sort of higher status. And so Darwin, what he's doing here, what Galton's doing here is looking at his family tree. So each symbol here is a member of the family that includes Darwin and Galton and Wedgwood. And he kind of traced out the family tree, the kids and stuff. And so you could see this as saying, okay, I had scientific ability and I married a woman that didn't. It was the time. I mean, the women didn't have an option to have a lot of scientific ability unless they were really, really, resourceful, dedicated women. It was very hard for a woman to be anything other than a wife and mother during this time. But anyway, they produced a couple of children, and the children, of the children, one of them had scientific ability. The other one didn't, but their offspring was considered brilliant. Okay, and this one that did, they ended up marrying a woman, and their offspring was considered brilliant. And so, at any rate, he goes through the whole family tree here, including the Darwin family tree and the Wedgwood family tree. And what he's basically saying is, "Hey, look at my family. There's a bunch of smart people, and it's inherited. It's coming down. We see this running down the family tree, running down the family lines." And so Darwin was saying intelligence or ability. Here he called it ability, but he was really talking about what we would colloquially call intelligence these days. He's saying that's inherited too. That might be determined by nature. Maybe our genes, he wouldn't have used the word genes at the time, but maybe our genes determine how intelligent we ultimately become. Okay, again, people were really falling in love with this notion of the power of genetics. And so Galton is now bringing this into psychology. Okay. All right. I think we're going dark days now. You ready for dark days? Ooh, here it is. Eugenics. Have you heard of eugenics? Because I hadn't heard of the so-called eugenics movement, but it was very powerful, and it was happening in the late 1800s, getting into the 1900s, World War I, World War II, that period of time. So late 1800s to World War II, we're going to kind of focus in there. And in these late 1800s, again, because of Darwin's work and because of people's fascination with genetics, this idea started to grow. And this idea goes as follows. There's all these species of animals on the planet. Every species is trying to be the best version of that species it can be, maybe. But what if we care about that? What if we as humans want future humans to be better than us? What if we want them to be more intelligent, better looking, stronger, etc.? Can we eliminate some of the weakness and the problems in our species? We have situations maybe of some people who, well, what are we going to call weakness? This is when it's going to get scary. What if you're just not very smart? Is that a problem? Would we like a future humanity that had fewer not so smart people in it? And so ultimately, the thing fueling all this thought was Darwin's work and genetics. They were saying, hey, if you want faster horses, you just make sure the fast horses breed. You don't let the slow horses breed. If the slow horses don't breed, so if we could take all the horses in the world, and if we could prevent all the slow horses from breeding and only have the fast horses breeding, the next generation of horses are going to be faster, like a lot faster. And so what if we did that with humans too? What if we determined the traits that we think are most important to our species? And so question number one is, well, what are those traits, right? So someone like Galton would say intelligence would be very high on that list. But that was one bit of debate. What are the traits that we consider, really valuable in the human species? If we could figure that out, then we could start to say, okay, is there anything we can do so that the people who have those traits have a bigger influence on the next generation of humans than those who don't have those traits, or who are, ranking low on those traits? What does that imply? That implies some sort of control over who is allowed to have children, right? That's pretty scary, right? This is where the creepy part comes in, because not only do you have to figure out what traits you want to have more plentiful, but then you have to figure out the mechanism. How are you going to prevent people who don't have those traits from producing children, or at least producing as many children as the people who do have those traits? Because you want their children to be the ones that are going to continue on. These sorts of issues were the focus of very serious scientific discussion. There were conferences around eugenics, and scientists from around the world would get together, and they had this notion in mind: we can make a better version of ourselves using genetics, and kind of thinking this through in principled ways. This is an example. University of London, the first International Eugenics Congress. Now let's check the date there, July 1912. So we're into the 1900s now. We kind of had 40 years of Darwin stewing, 40 or 50 years of Darwin stewing, people being fascinated by all that, Mendel doing his thing, and yes, even people like Galton kind of extending that in psychology. And then by 1912, we had this movement going, this eugenics movement. And there were meetings like this one listed right here. All these scientists talking about stuff. They didn't, scientists are often dinged for this point. They didn't fully appreciate the danger of what they were talking about, of what they were throwing around. They almost had to see the danger. It seems like sometimes happens with scientists, like they have to see the danger of their work before they go, oh, okay. Well, what's the danger? This is the danger, okay? There was somebody who really liked eugenics a lot. He found the notion fascinating. His name was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler wanted to build a better species of human being, right? Now, Adolf was an authoritarian. And so he said, well, I'm not going to wait for a bunch of scientists to figure out what are the most valued traits, and I'm not going to wait for them to come up with some process to select people that have them and prevent breeding of those that don't, yada, yada. No, I'm going to be much more direct. And so he just defined the Aryan race as the race that has all the values we wish all of humanity had. So we have the tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, German sort of stereotype. And he said those are the pure humans. Adolf himself was not one of those, by the way, which is always another sort of funny side story. But he saw them as representative of what this beautiful future human species would look like. And so he wanted to create this Aryan race, this race of people that had those specific traits. So what about this question of, well, how do you do that? He was very direct. If there's somebody who has characteristics that are not good, that do not fit my view of the perfect human, then, well, we can either sterilize them in some way, castrate them, make sure they won't breed, or maybe we could just kill them. If we just kill them, then they won't breed. And so he started, for example, he considered Jewish people not up to his standard. And he created these whole camps where they largely imprisoned and killed Jewish people in numbers that the world had never seen before. The Holocaust, what we call the Holocaust. The whole notion behind it, you always look at people like this and you say, surely he realized how evil he was. But at some level, he probably didn't. At some level, he probably thought he was doing hard and, yes, whatever work to reach a really noble and beautiful goal of producing that next beautiful human species. So he would even extend it to things like disease, right? If you had certain diseases, then he might figure it's better off to just kill that person, and we could maybe get rid of the disease. What if we killed everybody with a certain disease? If that disease has a genetic component, maybe that disease won't exist anymore and we won't have to deal with it. He took the eugenics idea and he weaponized it, for lack of a better way of saying it. He just ran with it. And that is when the scientific community and the rest of the world went, oh my goodness, we should not be thinking these thoughts. We should not ever be considering selective breeding or anything like that. This is where that leads. And so it was scary. And literally it was World War II that kind of, made people see that through Hitler's actions. So this brings me to John B. Watson and behaviorism. So I want to kind of, I'll read this quote in a second, but when you kind of go through, the textbook starts by talking to you about different areas of psychology and eventually talks about the history of psychology a little bit. And when it comes to behaviorism, what the textbook doesn't do is highlight this nature-nurture thing and not to the extent I'd like to see it anyway, and the extent of what Watson, who is the real father of the behaviorist approach, was motivated by, what he was trying to do. And let me put it this way. He basically said, I've been watching since Darwin everybody get excited about the effects of nature and acting like our experiences in life don't matter. But they do. And so he was suddenly the force of nurture. Watson. He wanted to contend all this excitement over nature influences that had led to eugenics. Right? People had seen where that had led to, and it was scary. And Watson's kind of approach was saying, yeah, but it was way overblown anyway. You guys were all focusing on nature. I'm going to show you the power of nurture. And so behaviorism is all about the effect that the environment has on us. So let's read this quote now. Men are built, not born. What's that mean? Built, not born. That means nurture, not nature. That's what he's saying with that quote. Give me the baby, and I'll make it climb and use its hands in constructing buildings of stone or wood. I'll make it a thief, a gunman, or a dope fiend. The possibilities of shaping in any direction are almost endless. He's kind of back to tabula rasa. He's saying, just give me a baby and I can make it anything you want. By the experiences that I give it, by the things that I have it experience in life, I will shape it in any direction you want. He is making a strong argument for the power of nurture here. And so you will literally see in the history of psychology, during a lot of the Wundt days, the very early, late 1800s into the early 1900s, we're seeing those structuralist approaches and those functionalist approaches. Again, the functionalist approach you're going to read about was largely inspired by Darwin as well. So when you read about William James, he was very much in that period of time when genetics was all the rage, right? But then comes Watson. And it's not coincidental that this was right around World War II when the behaviorist approach started to rise, because they had seen where a strict excitement over nature leads. And behaviorism is a direct opposition to that. Okay, so I just think I always found that was interesting. Just zoom out of here for a second. I always feel people need to understand eugenics a little bit and know the danger that's there, because it's just going to take another Hitler, right? I mean, the notion is valid. The idea that by choosing who can breed and who cannot breed, you will affect the next generation. And so it's scary because, somebody else could take up that flag. And when they do, we all have to see where that flag leads, and we have to be ready to oppose that sort of notion. And that's the kind of thing that John is trying to reinforce as well in the behaviorist stuff. Okay, cool. Leave it there. See you at the next one. Have a good one.